Today's topic is around one of the most classic, traditional, incredible wines, one of the most longest lived wines in the world, and one that does not get the respect that it deserves. It's a little bit like the Rodney Dangerfield of the wine world. We're talking about port. Now in today's video, I'm going to discuss port in general terms and then get into more detail around vintage port, along with having a tasting as well. Now, one of the things that I think really weighs on port's image is it's kind of looked at as stodgy, it's very old school, there's a lot of formality, a lot of etiquette tied to it, and that can be true, but some of that really does not add value, and I'm going to dispel some of that in today's video. And I want to get things down to the bare basics and make port more approachable. What is port? Port is a fortified wine made under very specific methods and only within the Douro Valley of Portugal. Now, to cut right to the chase, there are loads and loads of styles and variations of port, and we could do an entirely long extended video on all of those specifics. But to get it down to the basics, there's really two styles of port, one that is barrel-aged and one that is bottle-aged. The barrel-aged version will get its maturity through spending time in wood. And during that time, what will happen is the wine will soften, the aromatics will change, the color will change from more of a reddish to a tawny color, and the wine will be at its maturity when it's bottled. It will not age from that point forward. Bottle aged is a very different story. Bottle aged wines or ports will spend a limited amount of time in casks or wood, and then it will spend an extended period of maturation time in bottle. And during that time, the wine will change radically. It will develop a lot of character that it did not have in its early part of its life. So these are the types of wines that can age for many years. And there is some common ground between both the barrel and bottle age in terms of how the wines are produced. For one, there's the fortification process. Typically, somewhere around the midpoint of fermentation, a grape spirit will be added to the fermenting wine. What that will do is it'll stop the yeast from doing its thing, the fermentation stops, and there's a level of residual sugar that is retained in the wine. If the fortification process happens a bit earlier in the fermentation, that means there's going to be a bit more sugar in the wine. It has not been converted, therefore the wine's going to be a bit sweeter. If it's done a little bit later in the process, it'll be a bit drier. This is what the house styles are for various ports, but they all will have sweetness to them. They will generally have an alcohol level of 20%, and again, that's because of the fortification. And also the grape varieties used. These are traditional Portuguese grape varieties. There's a few that are predominant. Touriga Nacional, Tinta Cao, Tinta Reyes, those are the most common. And there's a whole laundry list of other grape varieties that are used as well. But these are generally deep, dark grape varieties that bring a lot of extract. Now that we have the basics of port out of the way, let's talk a little bit about vintage port. This is what we're going to be tasting in just a bit. Think of vintage port as being the absolute pinnacle or the very, very best of the bottle-aged ports. Vintage port will spend 2 years in wood. The rest of its life it will spend in the bottle. The wine will change a lot over that period of time, and that lifespan can be decades. Now, typically, vintage port is declared 3, maybe 4 years in every 10. Each individual port house or winery has the ability to pick and choose which vintages that it deems appropriate to call true vintage port. But generally speaking, there's groupings of vintages where the vast number of port houses will declare. The one that I have right here is a 94 Gould Campbell. And 94 is generally considered a vintage port for most houses. It's one of the great years in the last 30 years or so. Now, as for some of the formality that was discussed earlier, there are some that are important, some other things not so much. One that I believe is very important with vintage port is allowing the bottle to stand upright for a day or two. And I've done that with this particular wine. I pulled this out of my cellar. It's been resting on its side for an extended period of time. And what will happen is there is sediment that will start to form, and it'll form along the side of the bottle that was at the bottom of its resting point. I want to give it a little bit of time for that sediment to work its way down, because when the wine is served, I want to make sure that the wine and the sediment are separated. Sediment is not all that pleasant, so I want to make sure I eliminate that from anything that's going to be served. Now, one of the things that I will not be using today are port tongs. And these are essentially a metal clamp that gets red hot, and this attaches to the neck of the bottle. And instead of pulling the cork, what it does is actually snaps the neck off. Now, sometimes with some very, very old bottles, if the cork is very brittle and the wine's very delicate, that might be an option. With this wine being not quite 30 years old, I'm just using a traditional corkscrew. Okay, now we're ready to open the bottle of port, and what I'm using is just a traditional waiter's corkscrew. And in backup, just in case I need it, it's always handy to have one of these, this two-prong cork puller. So at this point, I am going to switch to a voiceover because things go sideways and I catch myself using some really bad language. So what I want to do at this point is remove the capsule. I'm using the serrated blade on the waiter's corkscrew. The capsule comes off, and the top of the cork looks clean. It looks firm. Everything looks as it should. Then I'm taking the waiter corkscrew, inserting it down the center of the cork, and being really careful because sometimes these corks can be fragile at this age. So down the center of the cork I go, and I'm going to give this a gentle tug. With a little bit of luck, the seal will break. And unfortunately, I do not get the little bit of luck, and the cork is starting to crumble and fall apart in my hands. So this corkscrew is not going to be what I need, and I need to switch over to the two-prong. This thing is an absolute savior. You take the longer prong, it goes between the outside of the cork and the inside of the lip of the bottle. The shorter prong then goes on the opposite side. It's inserted with a rocking back and forth motion. And when you get down to the point where you're ready to pull, you give it a gentle twist, you'll feel the seal break. And with a little bit of luck, that cork will come out in sound condition, and voila, it does. It's looking good. It's a little bit crumbly, but no problem. Now at this point, I'm ready to decant the port. I've got my decanter, and one of the keys with this is to make sure that the pour is one long, slow, continuous pour. You don't want there to be a lot of breaks, because what that's going to do is help to stir up the sediment, which is what you're trying to avoid. And then at this point, you continue to pour until you start to see some sediment appearing at the neck. You might have a light source behind the neck of the bottle. That'll also help. So there were just two steps in getting this wine prepared to get the absolute most out of it. One, we let the bottle stand upright for a couple of days to let the sediment work down to the bottom of the bottle. And two, the wine was put into a decanter with a careful pour. And what that allowed is, again, separation of any remaining sediment from the wine. And it also allows for the introduction of air into the wine, which is going to bring out a lot more of the aromatics. So it's time to give this a try. And the color looks really healthy. You never know when you have these older wines. Sometimes you get major disappointments with these wines, but this color looks very, very hopeful. It looks very youthful for a wine that's 30 years old. Aromatics are wonderful. I wish YouTube had smell-o-vision. Smells a little bit like Asian 5-spice. That is one big glass of goodness. It's ripe, rich, really full, good intensity. It's not showing any sign of being over the hill. amazing for a bottle of wine that's pushing 30 years old. Now, I should mention on the cost, I've had this wine for around 20 years. And I think when I first got this wine, it was maybe $35, $40 US. I looked it up on a couple of websites right now. The wine's around $100. If you wanted to gift a more recent bottle of vintage port, a really solid bottle is going to run you around $100. But keep in mind, it's something that can have a lot of mileage to it. And if there's some significance in that date, it's well worth the price. Again, think of it almost like you're buying a time capsule. I love this wine. Going to enjoy this over the next couple of days. I've got some gas to preserve it. It's absolutely fantastic. Thank you for staying to the end of the video. Please do comment down below. If there's anything that you're looking for in future videos, please drop your suggestions. I read everything that's posted. Thank you so much. Cheers.